So I'm Craig Ortner. I am in the high school where I serve as the AP and the testing coordinator. I also teach a section of algebra. And this is my first year at ASD. I don't have any kids, but my wife teaches learning support in the high school. And before this, we were in China for 3 years and Jakarta for 8 years before that. Before that, I was in Taipei and my wife was in Doha. So she knows the region a little bit, but I'm new to the region. It's wonderful. I'm pleased to see so many people with younger kids in the classroom or in the room because, as the AP coordinator, I work with a lot of older kids, and I was a IB diploma program coordinator for years before this. So I'm used to working with older kids, and it's so important to start young, right? And especially coming from different systems, different schools, there's a lot that is common, right? And that will be one of the themes of this presentation, actually. Things that we know about like learning generally, about how we learn. There's been a lot of growth in just the science of learning. So I always start, and our presentation template starts with the core documents. And so I always think to myself, what's the most important connection here? And to me, it was, as some of you mentioned, this in a rapidly changing world, which is for our students, of course, though they might not perceive it quite the same as we do, but also for us, right? Like I think I certainly feel it. I feel the world accelerating in some good and some bad ways. And the way that is most exciting to me, like I also agree, this is just, I'm fascinated by learning, it's almost not a stretch to call it a revolution, the cognitive science revolution in our understanding of how people learn. Everybody, right? Not just children, but in particular children. And I think the profession is still adapting and catching up, and kids are still adapting and catching up, and that's why it's so potentially high impact. So I hope that this can help us to adapt even faster. So this is kind of my structure for the next hour. We'll start with some of the things we might think we know, potentially busting some neuromyths. And I won't, they're not all myths, of course. So I don't want to give it away, but I've got a quiz for you. And then we'll dig into what do we actually have evidence to support now, right? So what do we think we know? What do we actually know? Or what are we more confident that we know? What do we have some good evidence for? And then finally, the most crucial question, the reason you're here, how can I actually support my child to put this into practice? So I am pulling this, from a number of sources over the years, but I wanted to identify a few, and I'll hit these again at the end under the further reading section if you are interested in this and would like to learn more. I have the hard copy of this Powerful Teaching, which could just as well be called Powerful Learning. This provides some of the structure. There's another wonderful book called Thanks for the Feedback that is only just one bit at the end. And then these are probably the two best. These next are two of the best education books anyone could ever read. They're both by Daniel Willingham, who I sometimes confuse with Dylan William, also good. They're in kind of reverse chronological order. Why Don't Students Like School? The original edition came out in 2010, I think. Incredible. If you're going to read one book, read that. Outsmart Your Brain is his most recent book, just came out this year. And that is his answer to the question. So he's a university professor of cognitive science, but also he teaches students, right? And so he's constantly trying to implement this and get his students to implement this. And they weren't. And so his question was, why, right? And so the Outsmart Your Brain is probably the most practical. And I'm taking some stuff from, there's chapter 6 in there, how to prepare for exams specifically. But it's full of really practical advice backed by science. So our question is going to be good habits and how to build them. Let me go back. I'm going to start with the quiz, with a pre-assessment, like any good teacher. This comes from this first resource, powerful teaching. And I made 10 copies, so maybe there's enough for every 2 people to share. And please feel free to cheat. This is not closed book or anything. It might be interesting actually to see whether you and people at your table.
I'm listening to the accountant. You are the cognitive scientist.
There, I've got copies so you can see it. So it's true or false. Let's take the next few minutes and fill it out, then we'll discuss. I will not collect them and mark them, but I will tell you I probably gave a lot away by titling it Neuromyths. There are 2 in here that are true, or that I shouldn't. True and false was the way we framed the questions. There are 2 that are supported by evidence from cognitive science. The rest are, there is nuance in many of them, some more nuanced than others, some more mythy than others. The 2 that are true, number 5, I should hope so, right? I mean, that's why you're sitting here. And number 9, breakfast. Yeah. Yeah. So the rest, Christine put it well, like these are things we've heard a lot, doesn't necessarily mean there is scientific evidence backing them up. And in fact, there are some, I highlighted, the one I put exclamations next to was number 4, about learning styles. Learning styles is sometimes teachers refer to as a zombie idea. It's this idea that you cannot kill. And even though there's not only no evidence to support it, there's evidence that shows that this is not true. It's not hard to test, right? You let people study in the method that they think they prefer, and you test whether it works better. It doesn't, right? So, but there absolutely is, like I'm a math teacher, right? There's absolutely truth to, I show students and I see myself graphical representations and algebraic representations and numeric representations of things, right? And seeing those different ways is absolutely valuable. I really like, as a math teacher, to see things visually. It doesn't make me a visual learner, right? In the sense that this is describing, right? So,
there's only, if I can just ask,
yeah, please.
these schools that do those, what are they called, the cognitive tests, where they actually do it when the kids are younger to actually see aptitude tests. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's very common in a lot of the British schools do it,
Huh.
and I think ASD does it. The Cat 4, that's the one I was looking for. Yeah, but isn't that testing the same thing?
Oh,
Cat 4?
I don't know the Cat 4 well enough. I, kind of looked over kids' shoulders as they took it recently. I don't think that's connected to learning styles exactly. I think it's more of a general reasoning test, which is another idea that we'll get to, general reasoning. Yeah.
With respect to that, with individual learning plans, so those aren't adapting to learning styles. I don't know
Correct.
about that.
Right, yeah. Learning styles means something very specific. They give the examples of auditory, visual, kinesthetic. It's the idea that I have a style, right? I am a visual learner, and so whatever I need to learn, I need to see it, right? And again, you can see where there's some truth in the idea, right? Like again, it makes some sense to me as a math teacher, but the idea that, as they state it nicely here, students learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style. It's literally not borne out by the evidence, right? Like it's testable, it's been tested, false, right? But we persist in believing it, right? Lots of teachers also, right? Which again, I think goes back to this point of we are in this kind of shift as a profession to becoming more like, I think it was, I don't remember if it was Willingham or Dylan William, analogized teaching to architecture. Right? There's absolutely art to it. Any architects in the room? No. Anyway, there's absolutely art to it, but there's also a lot of science. There's a lot of material science. There's a lot of engineering, right? If you want to build something that lasts, if you want to build skyscrapers, right, you have to know science, right? And I think that's where we are as a profession. We're learning a lot of science. So, a lot of things that we've heard a lot, and repeating things makes us think they're true, but are not true. A lot of neuromyths. So what actually does the cognitive science evidence support? So powerful teaching breaks it down into four categories, four things that I'll break it down. And then the last one is the most, the one we'll dig into the most. Retrieval, spacing, interleaving, and this is the big one, this is where we can have an impact also, feedback-driven metacognition, right? So giving students feedback, right? So they can think about their thinking, right? And then we'll go from 2D into, okay, how can I support that? If this is really the biggest lever, how can I support that? So let's talk just a little bit about each of these ideas. And here's, this is from Willingham's book, the more recent one, Outsmart Your Brain. He very nicely has these three ideas that I think, if we keep them in mind, can help us think about each of these practices, of why they are effective. And then at the end, there's another, it's not a quiz exactly, but I'm going to give you a list of things students could do, and we'll try to sort them into things I should encourage or things I should discourage. So these are all, it's all a quotation, but this is a phrase that is, to my mind, the most influential in like a lot of teachers' understanding of cognitive science, which is memory is the residue of thought, right? You remember what you think about, right? It's not, it sounds obvious, right? But he was really the first one to put it across to teachers in a pithy way like that. Organization helps memory, right? And probing memory improves memory. That's the first one we'll get to, which is retrieval. And I'll come back to the push-ups. So retrieval from long-term memory. And we did a little internal PD recently, and Cindy Warner-Dabrowski, our Director of Student Support, ran the session that I attended, and she did a much deeper dive on this. So there are absolutely people who have a lot more expertise, like there's that question in there about dyslexia. A lot of people that have a lot more expertise in some of these details, but we can learn a lot even from a general understanding. So I've got three different images or models for thinking about memory. But the key thing about retrieval is that we want to think about getting information out of kids' heads, right? We often think about, and I'm, as a teacher, absolutely, I think about what is it that I need my students to know and be able to do. I teach a class at 10, I have that in my head, and how am I going to do it, right? But it's possible to over-focus on that and forget this part, right? What's in their heads, both already, because you have to build onto that, but also because it strengthens their memory to retrieve it. Right? So here's the most scientific one. This is similar to the one that Cindy showed us in her workshop. You've got the outside world, stimuli, hitting your sensory memory, and you've only got so much that you can process. Right? You have to literally forget and ignore most of it in order to function in the world. Then you've got your working memory, which is, again, limited capacity. You can only hold so much in there, and when it's overwhelmed, like it's like a bucket that's, the water is all pouring out, you're losing stuff, right? Thankfully, we have long-term memory, which effectively has an infinite capacity, right? So we need to leverage this. In particular, right, the idea of retrieval practice is to emphasize this arrow. Pulling things out of long-term memory, right, and even just using that metaphor is a little bit incorrect. Accessing things in long-term memory strengthens your ability to access them again in the future, right? Here's another image. This one, the thing I love about this one is this comes from a middle school math blogger in Texas, I think it is, who I follow, who just writes brilliant stuff. He's just a middle school math teacher, but he is doing incredible reflection. And this comes from a whole blog post where he talks about, how he uses the things that he does in his classroom. But again, he focuses on, okay, how do I make sure I'm doing retrieval, right? Getting things out of kids' long-term memory, right? And this is all assuming that it's gone into long-term memory, right? That it's been encoded, which is another challenge, right? But the other challenge, and this is this kind of the answer to Willingham's outsmart your brain, right? The other challenge is we're tempted, and I'm giving away some of the end, we're tempted to use strategies that provide us an illusion of knowledge. When you go to study, sometimes you will do things that refresh your memory, but don't actually require you to access your long-term memory, right? So you go to the real world and you see something again, and you bring it into working memory, and you say to yourself, oh yes, I know that. You do, you know it right now, right? But for a very limited period of time. It's not here, right? And you haven't strengthened this by doing this, the purple arrow, okay? And here's a nicer, here's a nicer picture. Give away some of the future stuff. This is from Tom Sherrington, I think, another guy who works with schools, just about the importance of having a model of learning, right? And I just like that it's a much better picture. But and he calls it remembering. He doesn't call it retrieval. But yeah, it's just nice to have this picture, I think, because it helps you talk about all the things that need to go right, right? From attention to encoding or learning, and then the retrieval, this cycle that strengthens your long-term memory. Okay, so support number one, retrieval practice. There's evidence that doing this strengthens this. Practices number 2 and 3 are a little more, I was going to say a little more niche, but number 2 is still very valuable. Spacing, and we all know this. You saw in that last picture there was the forgetting, right? And in that previous diagram there was all this stuff that was from your overwhelmed working memory or from your sensory system, which was filtering out almost everything. If the goal is maximizing long-term memory, then it's best to space out your study or your retrieval. And I think teachers have all given kids this advice about cramming, right? Don't cram, right? But the trouble is cramming kind of works. Again, to come back to that Willingham, it works temporarily, right? So this is you learn something, and it kind of decays in your memory and you forget it. You bring it back, you retrieve it, right? Then it decays again, but a little more slowly. Bring it back slowly, right? Great process. This is the ideal picture. The cramming picture is, and here's why I say it works. I mean, because it does, depending on the amount that you have to learn and the complexity. You learn it. If you take a test here and you don't care about everything to the right, awesome. You won, right? The tragedy is, and I'm glad that you're all here and you're all thinking about it. You're thinking about AP courses, for example. If you do that for microeconomics, like all sorts of concepts and understanding that will be really valuable to have in your long-term memory for macroeconomics next year, gone, right? Whereas if you had done something more like this, right? This, you can see, is plateauing at a much higher level, right? So spacing has a long-term positive impact. Right? So if you can help your children to plan, right? Literal calendars, right? Some of my most successful students in the diploma program over the years, right? They put together calendars, right? For I'm going to study this on these days, right? Becomes incredibly important in AP classes, which eventually are going to test a year's worth of material. That's almost impossible to cram, right? And even more so in international baccalaureate DP classes that are 2 years of material. Okay, so retrieval, spacing, right? So it works better when an image on the next slide, when we space out our learning instead of, sometimes this is called massed practice. The next one,
Sorry, space.
oh yes.
Is being done by the teachers, right?
Both, yes, that's a perfect question. So someone said, a lot of this is encouraged, structured, facilitated by ASD, right? Like by the school. So yes, absolutely, teachers are doing this, right? Students also can do this, right, in their practice. And that's a perfect transition to this next slide, actually, which is something that teachers can do, but we have to be careful about, but students can more effectively do on their own, which is interleaving, mixing, basically. Here's a picture. So one way to study, right, would be to study all the yellow things together, right, in one chunk, then all the blue, right, and so on. Right? There's evidence to support that mixing them up, right, improves long-term memory. And to come back to your question, this is something as a teacher, right, I would not want to do. I would not want to do a little bit of my linear equations unit, in September, and then a little bit again in January and a little bit in March, right? And then come back and do quadratic equations. It doesn't make sense, right? However, when you're revising, it makes a lot of sense. And again, I'm a math teacher, so that's the perspective I come from. But the mechanism that this probably works by is by helping students to distinguish between types of questions. Because we just naturally, as teachers, we have to tell a story through a class. We have units of study, right? And they flow in a natural way, right? So we wouldn't want to do this. It would interrupt that natural flow. However, in the real world, right, if students want to transfer what they know, or even on a year-long AP exam, students are going to see a question, and it's not going to be tagged Unit 2, right? Part of the learning is, what is this, right? Mixing up your study helps you practice exactly that skill, right? And does that make sense?
Like in math,
Mm-hmm.
fractions, and then for fractions, like multiplication, division, subtraction, addition. It's connected, right? So if you know one unit, that unit leads to the second unit. I mean,
Yes. So math is a little bit special in the degree to which it is kind of ruthlessly cumulative, right? The nature by which it is connected, right? Which makes interleaving as a math teacher even a little more not advisable, right? It might make sense more in other contexts. I'd have to explore that with like subject leaders. This strategy would be more useful for students as they're revising. Again, I've got my AP coordinator hat on. If you're revising a year's worth of material, right, yes, there is some kind of natural story of that material that makes it hang together. And understanding that organization will help you. But mixing up your actual study will help you specifically with the skill of recognizing, what is this, right? Like, I'm looking at a question, I'm asked a question, what kind of question is it? What is it about, right? Because in the mixing, you had to do that. Does that make some sense? Okay. So we're coming to the fourth and highest leverage, most important strategy. Feedback-driven metacognition. So teachers daily, constantly, right, are giving students feedback in order to support their thinking about their thinking, right? And it's not at all easy to do. In part because we have some unfortunate ideas about feedback, right? Sometimes we think of it as what we do at the end. Okay, it's done, now I'm going to tell you it was good or not, right? And we're looking in the rear view mirror. And some research actually shows that can be worse than saying nothing, depending on how you do it, right? Ideally, has anyone actually taught their kid to drive. My dad like took me out in the truck on the back roads. And, yeah, Steve's done it. You want to give your kid feedback like in the moment, like, oh, adjust a little bit, right? Ideally, you want that. Sometimes you want that feedback, break yourself. But ideally, feedback is looking forward, right? It is not this is Dylan William. It's not a post-mortem. It's not an autopsy. It's a medical checkup, right? Well, you can still do something about it, right? And he says, Dylan William, the best feedback causes thinking. And the context that I think about this in always is the classroom that I was in myself. So I was briefly a lawyer, and one of the signature pedagogies of law school is the Socratic method, right? Where professors only ask you questions, right? Those questions were feedback, right? And those professors were calibrating them, right, to either make me think about another side or dig deeper. And they caused me to think, in part because I had to reply, right? But that's kind of the keystone that we're looking for, causing thinking. So this is just, if you're thinking about, well, what can I do, right? Well, we've all had that experience of, what did you do in school today, right? Nothing, right? Different questions, right, can cause more thinking, right? So slight adjustments to the "what did you do in school today" question to this one. Maybe I shouldn't have put that one first. Tell me 3 things you learned today, or twist it. Tell me something you learned yesterday, right, or last week, right? You're exploiting retrieval also, or kind of tricks. Tell me the weirdest thing you learned in school today, right? And now all of a sudden they're thinking about what was weird. Tell me the hardest thing, right? Or the most confusing, something you disagreed with. All of these twists on the question cause thinking. So here is, oh yes.
Can we just keep that one?
Yeah, and of course I'll share all of these. So you can access them, and they have in the notes some links to, there is, for example, a little 3-minute video of Dylan William talking about feedback that this quote comes from. So and I can come back to that. I'm about to hand you our next activity. Okay? And this is kind of the heart of things, I think. On the next slide, I'm going to give you a list of things students could do to study, right? That your students probably have done, have tried, maybe you've encouraged. And we're going to try to sort them into things we ought to encourage and things that provide the illusion of knowledge. And this is where those images I sped by were referring to knee push-ups. That's Daniel Willingham in his Outsmart Your Brain. He says, we tend to, in exercising our minds or our bodies, we try to do things that make us feel like we know or feel strong. You can do 100 push-ups on your knees, right? It doesn't actually make you stronger, right? It doesn't actually show that you're strong, right? Just like you can, I don't want to give things away, you can do a lot of things in studying. Kids spend hours and hours, right? And sometimes it stresses them out doing the equivalent of knee push-ups, right? That are not actually helping them, right? If they're willing to work hard, they could have a lot more impact if they choose strategies that require thought, leverage organization, and force them to do retrieval, which makes you confront what you do and do not know, right? And strengthens what you do know. All right, so I think, again, I have enough for people to share. And I will go back to that slide. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a good push-up. Even if you can just do one. Just do one good one's better than 25 on your knees. Here are Willingham's 3 principles for this is what good learning methods, what you see in good learning methods. Ones that recognize that memory is the residue of thought, ones that make you think, right, about the right things. That's the attention arrow. Organization helps memory. I'm able to understand and remember more math because I have in my head a structure, an organization of not all of mathematics, but much of mathematics. The fact that I have a degree in mathematics just helps me, right? All of your knowledge of your life and profession, it helps you slot every new thing that you learn into a system, into an organization that kids are still building, right? So anything that helps them not only cement things in long-term memory, but structure it in a way that helps it both stay and extend is useful. And finally, probing memory improves memory. Retrieval, doing retrieval. Again, it forces you to confront what you do not know, right? Because the illusion of knowledge is going to be burst when you sit down to that test. And it strengthens it. Like the act of accessing it makes it stronger, right? So, here are some things students could do. And I've left the ellipsis at the end so that you can add anything else your child, you might have encouraged, or you might have found useful, or your child might have asked about. I want to put each of these things into one of these boxes based on whether you think, useful, but should I encourage that, or should I discourage that? Real push-ups, like clapping push-ups, or knee push-ups. In the interest of time, so that we have time to discuss some of these, because I've heard fantastic conversations at each table and some good disagreements. Let's discuss where we should put each of these activities. And maybe, do you want to go, we could either go bullet point by bullet point, or we could focus on the ones that maybe you disagreed about, because those will be the most interesting ones to talk about. Were there ones at your table that you spent the most time talking about? Which was the most controversial? Flashcards. Okay. So, flashcards. Which box did you want to put flashcards in? Okay. Why?
Because it helps learning.
Okay. Can you connect it to the Willingham's thought, organization, or retrieval?
When you have something that pops up, like Rome, it's in Rome, Greece, social studies, for instance.
Yeah.
And you just watch Rome, and then, or in different countries. It keeps flashing, like it's, and it makes you think, okay, you can design it, you can create it in such a way that makes you creative.
Yeah. So there's, and a lot of these people ask good clarifying question. Am I creating flashcards? Am I merely using flashcards? I mean, I think both of them. Yeah. Sorry, in back.
Well, based on how you constantly wrote all the actions, I'm assuming you're using flashcards, right? It's based on the actions you put down.
Yeah.
I thought it was more of an illusion because they stress like a flash of like a word or an image or something. So you're retrieving information like quickly, but you're not analyzing anything. There's no
Are you even retrieving information? If it depends how you use the flashcard. Look at the front, right? And if you look at the front and then you flip it over and you read the back, you've not retrieved anything, right? You've refreshed your memory, right? If you look at the flashcard and you think even, or speak aloud, or write out what you think is on the back side of that card, and then you flip it over and you compare, now you have done thought and you've done retrieval, right? If you're creating the cards, you're potentially even doing organization, right? So again, all of this is how you use it. My bullet points were quite short, right? So it's good to elaborate. Yeah, which other? Potential tasks, highlighting. What did you think? Where did you put it? Okay. Yeah. Why?
That when you highlight, it helps you think, and it stands out as a point for you to help you retrieve your thoughts later on.
Okay. Did other people did even at your table? Did you disagree?
No, we agree. In
Oh,
fact,
okay.
having heard her now, I feel as if we can use organization, like you said.
Yeah.
and retrieval.
And again, like the flashcards, it depends how you are doing it, right? If you are thinking carefully about what am I highlighting these are the 3 main points, right? Now you're doing thought and you're doing organization, right? If you are, again, if you are misusing highlighting by, you've seen maybe kids' books where almost every sentence is highlighted, at which point, if everything is important, nothing is important, and you've not done these things, and it falls into the knee push-ups. It's easy to do, right? So, other of those activities that were particularly interesting to talk about at your table.
For us,
Yes.
it's also copying your notes.
Uh-huh.
If you just copy word by word versus then, I mean, in my case, I reorganize
Yes.
my notes.
Yes.
It depends, so.
Yes, so we had a good conversation about what does copying your notes mean? Is it just verbatim? I'm going to copy. Some people do that, right? Because they're like, okay, I'm going over it, right? But it's knee push-ups, right? If you want that to be thoughtful, to help with organization, right? Then you need to be distilling in some way, right? You take that mess of notes. I did the same, right? During the lecture, I took that mess of notes. And then afterward, I went back to create an outline and think about, okay, what are the main points? Thinking, organization, right? That's the key, right? So it's, yeah, the description alone might have been a little bit misleading. Yes, in the back. Which box did you put that in? Why is that? Yeah, much better to think and do something with it. Right? One of my professors made this suggestion that's always stuck with me. When you should read with a pen in your hand. 2, the things that you write in the margin should be questions, so that you're kind of building that internal dialogue with the text and with the author. Right? Do something with it. On your first reading, right, if you can, sometimes you just have to read, but certainly, rather than just rereading, do something with it. Think, right? Organize, right? Others?
Outlining, is it similar to the highlighting piece?
Why do you say that?
We agreed that it's around organization, where we're essentially thinking, we've done some work and you're looking at some skeletal structure, ultimately gleaning information out, connecting the thing. That's the way we understood it.
Yes, so that to me is also the key of outlining. It's that structure, right? An outline has, in my mind, I think of the Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, right? What are the 4 big ideas, the 4 headings, right? That act is the important part, right? Because outlining, if you're not properly outlining, can slide toward copying, right? That verbatim, you're not processing, you're not doing anything with it. It's knee push-ups. Okay. Okay. Any others in the last minute or so? What do you think? That's a good one.
I mean, we put it in thought, organization, retrieval, but I think it depends on the test. Like
Ah,
what you're-
how could it give? Yeah, how could it go either way? Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Right? Yes, taking a practice test, close your book. It's retrieval, right? And I've given kids and parents this advice over the years, right? It's great to do practice problems, again, from the math teacher point of view, but at some point, you want to practice in a kind of more realistic scenario. Close your book and try a few questions, ideally mixed up, interleaved questions, on your own. Try to retrieve it, see if it's there. If it's there, awesome, it's now even stronger. If it's not there, at least you know. If you are taking a practice test and then looking at each answer in the way that you might do homework, it's not going to have the same effect. And it also, there's a danger sometimes that we take the practice test, right? Great, I know it, and then I'm thinking back to that, the forgetting curve, and it just does this. If you're using the practice test to let yourself stop, right, that can be counterproductive because it's just going to keep decaying, right? Any others?
What about repeating information for yourself?
Yeah, what did you think?
We put it as a conclusion.
Why?
Just that if it's just literally just repeating it, not really thinking about it. But then I think there is the other side to it. If you're thinking while you say it, it's how you say it, I guess. You know, if you just
Yeah.
literally repeating it word by word. But when you say it, if you start thinking, then maybe that will help you.
Yeah, I was watching a kid give a presentation a while ago. Super brilliant kid, right? But I could tell that he had kind of memorized, and he had just repeated this script to himself rather than what I would call rehearsing and thinking as he went, right? Because he was an intelligent kid, like he knew what he was talking about, but that didn't fully come across because he had used a less than ideal method to prepare, right? So this isn't just tests, right? That's a really good thing to point out.
When you're doing public speaking, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about public speaking,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Do
I mean,
you memorize and you talk, like now you're talking to us, you know, and
I made slides, and then I printed out my slides, and then I wrote on my slides. And yeah, ideally, you're talking about something that you've read and thought a lot about over a period of time. Yeah, I know that's not the case for kids, right? Because they're required to learn so many different things, right? So the strategies can be harder to employ, right? Like, and we get a luxury as adults to choose. But yeah, these strategies apply to long-term memory generally in all sorts of tasks or ways to demonstrate our learning. All right, that is time. I want to point you to a couple other resources. These are a couple things that you can get from, there are two authors of this book. One is a cognitive scientist, Pooja Agarwal, and the other is a teacher, Patrice Bain. Pooja Agarwal and a few other cognitive scientists have learningscientists.org, and you can get all sorts of good stuff there. These are a couple examples if you'd like to dig deeper. And again, these are the four books that I use the most. Really, this one, I threw it in because it's got one really key insight about feedback, which is that we want to avoid it being ego involving, because as soon as you do that, it can short circuit the feedback. But we just didn't have time to get too deep into that. But feedback is another super impactful topic. And then again, I love these books, and I'm only halfway through the newest one, Outsmart Your Brain. Why Don't Students Like School is just, yeah, it's classic. If you're going to read one thing, I don't know, maybe read this one because it's a little more practical, but this one was more fundamental. All right, and I'll share the slides with you so you don't have to worry about photos or copying anything down. Although processing like that could certainly help.
so out of the four
Yeah.
books, which one would you, if there was one?
I would probably do this one. But I say that having not finished it yet. So this is Why Don't Students Like School, right? As the subtitle says, is Daniel Willingham, a cognitive scientist, explaining a lot of what I've just tried to share. And this is his, 10 years later, after his experience in the classroom, why aren't students doing this? He's teaching cognitive science to good, smart, motivated students. They're not doing what he's taught them to do, and he's wondering why. This is the answer, and it's the knee push-ups analogy. They're choosing to do things that give them the illusion of knowledge, right? Because it feels better, right? Rather than the hard work of, real push-ups.
Would you recommend kids reading this, like older children?
High school kids could absolutely, and probably even middle school kids could absolutely access this. Yes, yeah. Any other questions?
I was just asking
Yeah.
actually, because I have a 10th grader and
Uh-huh.
8th grader who, like I said, are very independent and
Mm.
they got it, if this was going to be presented to them, or if they were given any kind of tools to help them choose their best ways of learning and studying and going into AP.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have any plans for it. I imagine teachers are doing a lot of this kind of naturally all the time, right? Like when we give advice not to cram, right? Like we probably don't show them the forgetting curve, but we could, right? So a lot of that is probably happening naturally. But yeah, there probably are also, I was saying to someone when they walked in, I remember in grade 6 I had a quarter of study skills, right? There are places that this might fit in the curriculum also. Yeah.
Just a comment. I can totally see two things, having kids in elementary and middle school, that the school is doing that now makes sense to me. Like the feedback, like even in elementary, they go back and they work together to check their own work, or they switch and like someone checks another, like now it makes sense. And then I've always said like, oh my God, they're repeating what they did last year, but now I can see why. It's like, oh my God, again, they're gonna see the same thing, but now I can see so that the
Yeah, with more
the
nuance.
showing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're ideally, it's going to cement it, and they're going to get deeper into it, make more connections. It's great to hear that. And the feedback, is absolutely, it is probably the most impactful thing we do as teachers, to get feedback right, and it's really hard to do. All right, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
That was great, thank you so much.